Thanks, Eddie. So what I'm going to do to start out here is give a kind of overview of one element, what I'm calling mystical dereliction and mystical affliction. And of course, I'll touch on a number of different figures, each of which could be the subject of an entire lecture. So it's kind of a flying view, a helicopter view of a terrain, which is a very rich terrain. And fortunately, there'll be a number of papers on some of the persons that I will be touching on here. And I will try to do that within our time frame. So I'm going to start with a quotation from 1 Peter, 2nd chapter, verse 21. If you endure and do right and suffer for it, you have God's approval. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you should follow in his steps. In Christian history, the theology of suffering rests, I think, on two New Testament pillars. The first is the witness in the Gospels and Acts that Christ himself had to suffer many things, pola pathein, in order to redeem humanity, and that this was foretold in the Scriptures. An addendum to the gospel message about the necessity of Christ's suffering is found in the teachings of the Epistle to the Hebrews about Christ being tested by what he suffered, and even that he learned obedience through what he suffered. And having been made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all those who obey him. Second pillar of the Christian view of suffering is the insistence, both in the Pauline corpus and in 1 Peter, that the believer is called upon to suffer with Christ. That is, as Paul put it in Romans 8, we are children and heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ, if in fact we suffer with him, so that we may also be glorified with him. Thus, the sufferings of Christ abound in us, as also his consolations, Paul says in 2 Corinthians. The privilege of believing in Christ entails suffering for him, as Paul says in Philippians. If we share in his sufferings by becoming like him in death, like him we will attain resurrection from the dead. That is, as Paul puts it in Colossians 1:24, in my flesh I am completing what is lacking in Christ's afflictions for the sake of his body, that is the church. This message has never been absent from Christian history. However uncomfortable some of its historical manifestations make us feel today. In our own times, it's been strongly endorsed by Pope John Paul II in an address he gave in 1984, commemoration of the appearance of the Blessed Virgin at Lourdes. Commenting on texts from Paul, the Pope said, I quote, "The joy comes from the discovery of the meaning of suffering. What we express with the word suffering seems to be particularly essential to the nature of man. Suffering seems to belong to man's transcendence. Christianity is not a system into which we have to fit the awkward fact of pain. In a sense, it creates rather than solves the problem of pain." Suffering inevitably calls up the language of pain, as we can see from John Paul's statement, but I think it's important to remember that while suffering and pain often go together, they're not precisely the same thing. Pain is a physiological sensation related to some injury to the body, one that involves complex neurological issues. Suffering is an emotional reaction to some situation, one often connected to bodily pain, but it can be related to other events, like the death of a beloved person, that does not entail actual physical injury. The sufferings of Jesus referred to in the New Testament embrace both physical pain and mental anguish. The Gospels, of course, depict Jesus suffering or undergoing many things during his preaching years. The difficulties of his wandering life, the threats and opposition he encountered, all involved mental suffering and probably some measure of physical pain. Although it's worth reminding ourselves that the preacher from Galilee specifically noted that his was not a life of severe asceticism in the manner, for example, of John the Baptist. Of course, it's the events surrounding Jesus' death on the cross that the Pauline and Petrine texts have in mind when they talk about filling up Christ's sufferings. Scenario of the Passion begins with the account of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane on the night before his crucifixion. He announced, "I'm deeply grieved even to the point of death," and prayed to his Father to let the cup of his sufferings pass from him, if at all possible. Christ's inner sufferings were increased by the physical pain involved in his arrest, trial, scourging during the night and the next morning, and they culminated in the horrific act of his public crucifixion. While on the cross, as Matthew and Mark tell us, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani," that is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Quoting Psalm 22. Now, I mention these familiar details here because the model of completing the sufferings of the crucified Christ was always tied to the Passion narrative. The mental anguish of Christ in Gethsemane, his cry of alienation and estrangement from the Father on the cross, were particularly important for the strand in Christian thinking, especially Christian mystical thinking, that holds that Christ's mental sufferings were even worse than the physical pain he underwent. An important result of the medicalization of pain beginning in the second half of the 19th century is that it's often difficult for us moderns to understand the role of pain and suffering throughout most of recorded history. Pain was a fact of life, not an aberrant condition to be overcome by medical intervention. The fact that Christians often suffered pain inflicted by others, take the example of the martyrs, and even more so that Christians inflicted pain on themselves through severe ascetical practices, appear to many people today perhaps bizarre, even a kind of species of masochism. Nonetheless, as Ariel Glucklich has pointed out in the book Sacred Pain, many religions have viewed pain as an important, even a necessary step in the religious progress of the person. Not so much the suffering caused by the pain, but the attitude towards the suffering that's central. I quote from Glucklich's book, metaphorically, pain creates an embodied absence and makes way for a new and greater presence. There are many attitudes to pain and suffering in Christian history. Here I'm only going to focus on one strand of primarily mental suffering that has had a long trajectory in the story of Christian mysticism. That is the sense of being abandoned by God, the dereliction, estrangement, forsakenness of which so many mystics have spoken. It's a paradox, of course, that those most devoted to finding God have often experienced, sometimes for great lengths, abandonment by God. In other cases, God has been present to them, but as a torturer, a source of affliction, not as a loving God. Like Jesus on the cross, these mystics feel compelled to cry out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Mystical dereliction and affliction, as I'm calling it, involves a wide range of terms and images, but I would say the two general modalities seem to predominate. The first is the sense of immense loss and alienation, the pain of estrangement that comes from being abandoned by God. The second is the feeling of dread and terror in the face of the presence of God, who appears as a judge, not as Savior. In some mystics, one side prevails over the other. In other mystics, both forms of dereliction, affliction are present. So here's where I'm going to go into a kind of historical overview, not touching on everybody who advances this perspective, but on some of the major figures. There's little evidence for mystical dereliction in the first 5 Christian centuries, perhaps because early views of the Passion and Cross did not emphasize Christ's physical or mental sufferings, but rather the triumph over sin and death effected by the entire Paschal mystery. Thus, the cross that most often appears in early Christian public art, such as the mosaics of the great basilicas, is a triumphant crux gemata, the shining cross with gold and jewels figuring the splendor of heaven. It's also maybe because of the importance of the theme of martyrdom in the early church, as the real way to suffer with Christ, that we don't find what I would call mystical dereliction and alienation. So for me, at least as I've been able to see, the first figure who advances a mysticism in which the theme of fear and affliction is strong is Pope Gregory the Great, Pope from 590 to 604, who is, of course, a kind of hinge between the patristic Christian antiquity period and the early Middle Ages. Despite his aristocratic background and successful career in the Roman Church, Gregory suffered much, both through ill health and also the desperate situation of 6th century Rome, harassed by barbarian foes. Thus, he felt a particular sympathy for the figure of the suffering Job and composed his longest work, the massive Moralia in Job, to reveal the moral and mystical message of the book. For Gregory, like most patristic exegetes, Job and his sufferings were not so much important in themselves, but as a type of the suffering of Christ. As he put it in Book 23 of the Moralia, I quote here, "Holy Job is the one who more truly is a type of the mediator, insofar as he prophesied his passion not only in words, but also in his suffering. Perhaps because he depended on the suffering of the Redeemer in his own words and deeds, he is sometimes quickly drawn to bodily signification." Gregory's biblical mysticism features many explorations of the necessity of holding opposed polarities in tension during our life in this fallen world. Polarities like light and darkness, silence and sound, joy and fear, and above all, the tension between the inner and the outer. Jean Leclerc once said that Gregory's thinking is characterized by a law of alternation between one and the other side of these polarities. Hence, we shouldn't be surprised that contemplative ascent to God for Gregory involves both joy and fear, elevation and terror, because the overwhelming majesty of God goes beyond all human categories. And this theme is shot throughout Gregory's writings, but especially in the Moralia. Let me quote just a passage or two. Job 4:13 contains an account of Eliphaz's seeing God in the horror of a vision by night, in Horrore Visionis Nocturnae in the Vulgate. Gregory explains this horror of the vision by night as a fear of hidden contemplation, noting that the higher the soul is drawn towards God, the incircumscribable light, the more it becomes conscious of its sins and imperfections and therefore is filled with terror. There's a direct correlation between the height of the soul's contemplation and the intensity of its fear. He says, "The human soul is lifted high by the engine of its contemplation, so that the more it gazes on things higher than itself, the more it is filled with terror." This is not to say that contemplative experience does not also contain joy and loving desire, but this dialectic experience, the alternation back and forth, allows for both a joy and loving desire, but also, of course, the fear that induces humility, which is even more important than the delight of experiencing God, because the delight of experiencing God could lead the contemplative to pride, whereas the experience of terror always induces the contemplative to continuing humility. So God does not abandon the contemplative in Gregory's view, but his presence brings with it a special form of fear and suffering. Although Gregory was widely read by medieval monks, I've not found many examples, or really any examples, of monastic writers of the early Middle Ages who pick up on this theme. But from the 13th century on, we find an era here, an era that I call the New Mysticism. There is evident a strong wave of a true mysticism of dereliction. That is a consciousness of God that often implies terror and also can emphasize the suffering and affliction that comes when God abandons the soul, leaving the person in a situation that resembles hell, the place of ultimate loss and estrangement. And this is clear in the cases of both female and male mystics from diverse linguistic worlds and religious backgrounds. I think some people think it's mostly women mystics. It's not. And it's not one particular mystical tradition. It's found in many mystical traditions. Let me give you two premier examples in the 13th century, the German beguine Mechthild of Magdeburg, who dies around 1280, and the Italian Third Order Franciscan Angela of Foligno, who dies in 1310. There are others, but I'm just choosing these two. Mechthild's book, The Flowing Light of the Godhead, is a collection of 7 books of chapters in many genres, gradually put together in her lifetime, both her years as a beguine and her last years as a Cistercian nun. It does not survive in the original Low German form, but only in subsequent Latin and High German translations. Although not very popular in the Middle Ages, there's only a few manuscripts, The Flowing Light has emerged as one of the most studied medieval mystical texts in recent decades, both for its linguistic virtuosity and for its challenging theology. There's no simple way to describe Mechthild's notion of the path to union with God. But in terms of our theme, it is manifest that the path involves not only experiences of erotic delight in God, but also times of painful estrangement, Gottesfremdung in the German version, or rejection, Verworfenheit. Mechthild describes these experiences with startling directness. In some late texts of the book, that is towards books 6 and 7, Mechthild sketches a threefold itinerary to God that seems to place the state of rejection and suffering in the highest place of the mystical path. For example, Flowing Light, book 6, chapter 20. God bestowed on me the favor that is written down in this book in a threefold manner. First of all, with great tenderness, then with high intimacy, now with intense suffering. I much prefer to remain in this state than in the other two. Here, Mechthild may be reflecting on her situation as a sick and blind old woman, but it's equally possible that she's summarizing the powerful experiences of being rejected by God that are recorded in a number of places throughout the earlier books. Mechthild often spoke of soaring up into God, but there are contrasting passages in which she sinks down into pain and suffering, even as far as hell itself. Example from book 4, chapter 12, where God allows her to fall down into the state of the souls in purgatory, and then further down even to those in hell. Mechthild nonetheless welcomes the loss of all consolation. She makes the plea, "Oh, leave me, dear God, and let me sink further down for your honor." Sinking ever deeper, she says, after this came constant estrangement from God, and enveloped the soul so completely that the blessed soul said, "Welcome, blessed estrangement. But Lord, you should take delight from me and let me have estrangement from you." Although she recognizes that God is with her, even in this estrangement, it has a profound effect of physical suffering. She says her body sweated and writhed in powerful cramping during this experience. And in the midst of the experience, she overhears a conversation between Christ and Frau Pain, Lady Pain, in which Jesus reminds Pain that although she is the devil's servant, she was also his closest garment while he was on earth. So with Mechthild, Christ as the Redeemer suffering on the cross has become the exemplar of painful suffering, including estrangement from God. My God, why have you forsaken me?" Mechthild comes to identify more and more with the kenotic Christ on the cross, as we can see in a poem found in Flowing Light 3:10, where the beguine's loving soul lives out the events of Christ's passion in her daily life and practices. And of course, living out each of the events of the passion is found in a number of 13th century mystical women. Angela Foligno. Angela was a generation younger than Mechthild and came from a different spiritual tradition, that of the Third Order Franciscans, laymen and women who sought to imitate Francis, the perfect model of the crucified Christ. Angela herself was illiterate, not lettered, but the account of her spiritual journey, the Memoriale, was taken down by a friendly friar, but the friar found it hard to understand her, as the text even today, with 30 stages of the advance to Christ, remains for the reader. But it's obvious Angela's encounter with Christ centered on the cross, as it did, of course, for so many women mystics. What's special about her version of the passion mysticism, is how she goes beyond the state of sharing in Christ's physical sufferings in order to explore the realm of dereliction and despair in the face of the God who hides himself and torments the soul who seeks him. Still, the stage of suffering and estrangement was not the final stage for Angela, since it occupies the sixth stage, the sixth place among the 7 supplementary passus as recorded by the friar. He says, by the way, that she had many more passus than that, but he just couldn't understand them all. So he's kind of going to put them down to 7. But the final one there is a stage of union with the Trinity, but the penultimate one is going to be the stage of suffering. After enjoying erotic union with Christ in stage 5, then, in stage 6, God allows Angela to suffer demonic assaults both in soul and body that bring her to the edge of despair. In a telling image, she says, and I quote here, "She found herself incapable of finding any other comparison than that of a man hanged by the neck, with his hands tied behind his back, his eyes blindfolded, who remains dangling on the gallows and yet lives, with no help, no support, no remedy, swinging in the air." At that point, she turns tables on Christ and she cries out, my son, do not abandon me." And she says this is an experience of damnation. "I see myself as damned, but I am in no way preoccupied with this damnation. Rather, what concerns me and grieves me most is having offended my Creator." And then it's after that experience of hanging by the neck and crying out to Christ that she passes on to the final stage, the 7th passus. Now, I've cited 2 women, but it would be a mistake to suppose that the mysticism of dereliction was restricted to women mystics, as I said at the beginning. Angela's contemporary, the poet, mystic, and spiritual Franciscan Jacopone da Todi, is a case in point, and I could certainly say more about him. But I want to pass to 2 male mystics from the 14th century who can provide evidence for just how widespread mystical dereliction became in the later Middle Ages. First, the Dominican John Fowler, who dies in 1361, although deeply influenced by Meister Eckhart, differed from his master in many ways, not least by his extensive teaching on the sufferings endured by those whom God seemingly had abandoned, conditions that he described by terms like lostness, Verlossenheit, distress, Gedränge, and in the evocative metaphor of night work, Arbeit der Nacht. The imitation of the passion was central for Fowler, but he did not revel in bloody imitation of Christ's physical sufferings, such as we find in his contemporary Henry Suso in the famous Life of the Servant. Rather, Fowler insisted that the essence of imitating Christ rests in total surrender of the will, Gelassenheit, a releasement that was bound to involve experiencing the desolation that Christ endured on the cross. I'll cite just 2 of his sermons, but there's lots of text in Fowler. Sermon 39 distinguishes 3 stages in the mystical path. The first is that of the milk of spiritual sweetness, which prepares the devout soul for the stronger food of the second stage. In stage 2, Fowler says, a person is led along a very wild path, totally dark and foreign. On this road, God takes away from him everything he ever gave him. The person is left so much alone that he knows nothing of God. He comes into such distress, Gedränge, he comes into such distress that he is not sure if he was ever right, or if he ever had a God or not, or whether he even exists or not. This state is spoken of as a state of poverty of spirit, in which in a strange way God withdraws himself from the soul, leaving it in what Fowler calls a painful deprivation of spirit. But there's a third stage. So there's a stage beyond the stage of Gelassenheit, and the third stage is the stage of final union of the created spirit with the self-existent Spirit of God. Another text, Sermon 37, Fowler looks to Christ as the example of the dereliction of love. He says, "This is love, that a person is ever on fire in seeking and in lacking and in the feeling of being abandoned. One remains in constant torment, but content to be tormented. In this torment, a person is melted and consumed by the fire of desire, and yet is in equal contentment." He concludes, "This is love. It is not what you imagined it to be." Fowler's Christocentrism and reliance on faith were welcomed by Luther, for example, as was his emphasis on suffering and terror endured by the believer whom the hidden God abandoned to hell. And Luther read Fowler and even annotated Fowler's sermons that had been published in 1508 and again in 1516. And Luther would be another example, whether we want to consider Luther or not, of someone for whom terror and abandonment was very crucial to his religious development. I'll cite just one text. Most of us here are theologians, or many of us are theologians. Luther said, by living and yet more by dying and being damned, you become a theologian, not by understanding, reading, and teaching." This is what Luther once called fleeing to God against God. Less well known than Fowler, and far less educated than the learned friar, was Jan van Leuven, the lay brother known as the Good Cook at the Augustinian monastery of Gronendaal outside Brussels, the house of the famous Flemish mystic Jan van Ruysbroek. The Good Cook was very much influenced by Ruysbroek, but his several mystical treatises in Middle Dutch display some features and themes not found in his master. Jan van Leuven, for instance, worked out an original, a somewhat confusing mystical itinerary in his treatise, What Pertains to a Person Poor in Spirit. Of more interest to us and our theme is the dominance of mystical dereliction in both his work on the Ten Commandments, as well as in the excerpts from this found in the account of his life written by the Gronendaal hagiographer Johannes Pomerius. And the Johannes Pomerius' Vita Boni Koki, the life of the Good Cook, is more accessible. Actually, I don't think there's a modern edition of the treatise. Pomerius says that on a certain night, God manifested himself to Jan, first in an experience of loving union, and then with 7 torments, not so much wondrous as unbearable to any person from a natural point of view, and almost unbelievable to someone who did not experience them, punishments that he bore in the same instant. This is chapter 11 of the Life of the Good Cook. The account of the 7 hellish torments, the Latin is angustiae infernalis, the 7 hellish torments that follows features trials such as interior desolation, loss of hope in God, a sense of total sinfulness. But the 7th torment is by far the worst and provides us with a remarkable image of the hellish pain of mystical dereliction. I quote from this somewhat, I'm shortening the text, but somewhat at length. Pomerius, quoting Jan, says, "It was as if the ground we walk on became so many thousands of dense and deep pieces as there are blades of grass on earth, drops of water in the sea, grains of sand on the seashore. When that happened, it was as if the earth divided itself from top to bottom so that the person was placed in the middle of the earth with both body and soul. And then the earth fastened that person with its weight on every side, pressing towards the center, squeezing and contracting with its force. This would certainly be an intolerable torment if the person were compelled to always live there in the middle of the earth, at every moment longing to die due to the unsupportable violence of the pressure." That's in some ways a little comparable to the Angelo Foligno text, but you can see the different models that some of these mystics are using. The wave of mystical affliction did not cease in the 14th century, since there's ample evidence for its importance in the 15th and 16th centuries. Among many possible witnesses, I'm only going to consider 2 15th century female mystics, again from different traditions. Alit Baca dies in 1455 from the Low Countries, and the Italian Camilla Battista da Varano who writes at the very end of the 15th century and dies in 1524. And then I will transit in the 16th century to the famous mystics Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross. Aliet Baca was born in Utrecht from a wealthy family, and in 1440 she entered the Galilee convent at Ghent, a house of the Augustinian nuns of the Windesheim congregation who were associated with the Devotio Moderna. Although she encountered opposition in the beginning, Aliet succeeded and served as prioress of her house for 10 years before she was deposed, we don't know why, and died shortly thereafter. Unlike most of the members of the Devotio Moderna, Aliet had a strong calling to an inner mystical life, which she saw as confirmed by two visions she received, one in Christmas 1440, the other on the Vigil of the Ascension in 1441. She was educated and well-read in mystical literature. She composed a spiritual autobiography called My Beginning and Progress, as well as several mystical treatises, the most important being The Four Ways of the Cross. The Four Ways of the Cross. That's probably written about 1445, and that's the text I want to touch on briefly. This treatise is one of the most powerful witnesses to late medieval Passion mysticism, despite its unclarity in some places. Its fundamental message is about attaining transforming union with God by co-suffering with Christ. Co-suffering with Christ on the cross, according to a threefold pattern: the pattern of letting go, suffering, loving. Letting go, suffering, loving. The first three of the four ways of the cross are treated pretty briefly in the text, while the fourth way takes up 2/3 of the whole treatise. The fourth way is a detailed account of the path of darkness, abandonment, dereliction, annihilation, following the model of Christ's passion. Aliet says this way is not like the first three. I quote, "Because all that is exercised in the first three must be left behind, because this way does not lead upward in exercises of enlightening and of tasting and of enjoying, but downward into letting go, suffering, purer love. The person must become nothing by dying with Christ, so that she is thereby brought into great darkness and desolation and dryness, and into as great a poverty and misery as she once was rich." The letting go and suffering of the fourth way are described in strong terms, but unlike some other mystics, Aliet says that God does not totally abandon the soul at this stage, but he continues to whisper in the depths of the soul, in a voice without words that was born of God, into the spirit of the person, giving witness, awakening, renewing desire, speaking beyond any reason. So God may provide brief moments of union during the fourth way, but Aliet insists that the soul must not desire to know or feel or taste divine delights, but must continue the letting go and suffering where love is exercised most highly and nobly in everything that a person might do. Toward the end of the account, Aliet emphasizes that this way is the truest imitation of Christ, because it follows the footsteps where, and I quote, "He stood in that night when he began to suffer his bitter passion for our sakes." So it's necessary to begin with Gethsemane, and to suffer and die with Christ in order to gain a resurrection that is a saving harvest for Holy Church. Camilla Battista da Varano was a Franciscan nun who composed her spiritual autobiography, a text called the Vita Spirituale, probably in 1491. The work has two main parts. Chapters 3 to 11 tell the story of her life in the world. Chapters 12 through 19 recount the first decade of her time in the convents. That's 1481 to 91. And this section, the second section, treats the many mystical graces she had received, but concludes in chapters 17 through 19 with an account of her hellish state of mystical dereliction, what she calls my most unhappy happiness, mia infelicissima felicità. These trials, which she describes as a great battle against Satan, began in October 1488 as a part of her holy desire to enter the inner places of the desert, that is, the the most secret sufferings of the heart of Christ. One of the other of Camilla's treatises, by the way, is a treatise on the inner suffering of Christ. It's very popular, printed half a dozen times at least in the 16th century. Although Camilla uses erotic images from the Song of Songs to illustrate her encounters with Jesus, the predominant note of these years was of divine love as the source of pain and suffering. The tears she shed for Christ crucified were merged with the sea of her own inner sufferings. When she is introduced into the most secret bedchamber of the myrrh-soaked heart of Jesus, that's a wonderful image, the myrrh-soaked heart of Jesus. This is the one and true most envenomed sea that cannot be navigated by any intellect. I would have often been submerged and drowned in that sea, she says, if the powerful hand of God had not aided me, because I was much less able to support such bitterness than the sweetness of divine love. I would say at that time, she continues, no more, my Lord, I am drowning because this sea has no bottom or end. In such an experience, Battista says that God's essence no longer seems like a paradise of joy, but it feels like a cruel hell. Uno crudele inferno. So Christ has become God has become a cruel hell. The paradoxes of divine love, how can the soul ever love God enough, that are explored in the final chapters of the spiritual life, lead Camilla eventually to cast herself at the foot of the Redeemer and to express her wish, following St. Paul in Romans 9, to be damned if this should be God's will. Now I'll turn, our time is doing okay. I'll turn to just two examples of Teresa and John of the Cross, and then I'll mention a few later examples just to show the continuity. Experiences of desolation and dereliction don't have an exactly constitutive role in the mystical path of Teresa, as presented first in her life and then in the interior castle. Nonetheless, the life does recount several negative experiences that God sent Teresa as part of the purgation necessary on the way to union. There are three such passages found in the life. The first is in Life 20. It was a painful experience of extreme desolation. Teresa said it was like being set down in a desert without any other creatures nearby. Here she continues, the soul receives no consolation and feels that it is crucified, but its desire for heaven so increases that it loses its sense awareness and even becomes rigid. Despite many comparisons in this section of chapter 29 through 16, Teresa says she has trouble describing this form of solitude and suffering. God seems far away, but he's actually communicating his grandeurs in the most strange manner thinkable. He also tells Teresa that she should esteem this gift more than all the others because of its effectiveness in purifying the soul. So that's the first experience. The second and third experiences recounted in the life deal with the sense of being consigned to hell. In Life 30, chapter 30, she speaks of how God allowed the devil to torture her with an internal sense of being completely in the dark and suffering the fires of hell. She says, in my opinion, the experience is a kind of copy of hell, for the soul burns within itself without knowing who started the fire, or where it comes from, or how to flee from it, or what to put it out with. The final event, which probably happened maybe in 1560, these events are not in chronological order. The final event, described in chapter 32, is an experience of being trapped in hell that terrified Teresa for years afterwards. She says that she felt a constriction, suffocation, and affliction that made it seem like the soul was tearing itself apart. She goes on, I felt myself burning and crumbling, and I repeat that the worst thing was that interior fire and the despair. The fire was accompanied by a feeling of suffocation, which she describes as being placed in a kind of hole made in a wall. These walls, she says, which were terrifying to see, closed in on themselves and suffocated everything. There was no light, but all was enveloped in the blackest darkness. Nonetheless, Teresa says that this experience is one of the greatest gifts that God ever gave her because it helped her to lose her fear of all earthly tribulations. You'll note how often these experiences are described as a kind of being trapped. and being constricted, or else being constricted around the neck by the gallows, or else being trapped in hell, being in a hole in a wall. So, John of the Cross. John, Teresa's friend and collaborator in the Carmelite reform, is probably the best known proponent of the necessity of inner stripping and suffering on the path to union with God, what the friars we know called the dark night. John underwent great physical suffering at the hand of his Carmelite brethren during his imprisonment in Toledo, December 1577 to August 1578, a period that he compared to the 3 days that Jonah spent in the belly of the whale. Nonetheless, John later testified that the Lord had given him great consolations even during these very difficult years, the difficult days, months. And the poem on which his account of the dark night is based is not one of the poems he wrote in prison. It was probably written shortly thereafter. It may reflect the prison experience. His imprisonment, of course, was a decisive event in John's life. He had been known previously as a gifted spiritual director, but after it he emerged as a great poet and great mystical writer. As John began to share his poems and his spiritual counsel with the Carmelite nuns and friars after his release, he received requests to explain his teaching about the ascent of Mount Carmel to attain union with God. He even drew a sketch of the ascent, possibly as early as 1580 or so. And during the period 1581 to 85, he composed two versions of two commentaries on his poems. The first work is the Spiritual Canticle, which comments on the poem Cantico Espiritual that he had begun writing while he was in jail. The second work is the Ascent of Mount Carmel, which comments on the poem En una noche oscura, on a dark night. The Ascent treatise explaining the Noche Oscura enshrines John's teaching on the night of sense and the night of spirit, the dark night. Not the dark night of the soul, which is not his terminology, actually. So I'll say a little bit about these two famous works, particularly the Ascent of Mount Carmel and Dark Night. They're really two parts of the same treatise. The book is structured according to the basic anthropological division in humanity of the sense and the spirit aspects of the human person. Both sense and spirit must be purged of all human attachments in order to attain God, and in two ways: actively, when a person cooperates with grace, and passively when God alone is at work. Thus, there are altogether 4 nights. The whole process is called night for 3 reasons, says John. First, denial of the senses is like a night. Second, the road taken must be that of the night of faith. Third, the goal is God, who is a dark night for the soul in this life. The practice of the 4 nights goes far beyond ordinary asceticism. It involves negative language about God, it involves a negation of all desire, and it even encompasses the negation of affliction, wherein God subjects the soul to severe inner suffering. You might say John is not a proponent of mystical dereliction as such, in the sense that God doesn't abandon the soul. Rather, God remains present, but veiled under the dark burning of faith, hope, and charity, as these 3 theological virtues purify the soul of all its false appetites, attachments, intellectual apprehensions. The rigorous purgative process is founded in John's conviction that in order to overcome the sensory and spiritual barriers to attaining God, we must become subject to the dialectic of todo nada, everything, nothing. As he put it at the outset of his treatment of the nights, and I quote, "To reach satisfaction in all, desire satisfaction in nothing. To come to possess all, desire the possession of nothing. To arrive at being all, desire to be nothing." So it's the renunciation of desire, not any excessive mortification, which is the key to John's understanding of the dark night. The active night of the senses, is ascetic disciplining of the appetites, takes up Book 1 of the Ascent, part of the treatise. Books 2 and 3 of the Ascent treat the active purging of the intellective power of the spirit through the dark path of faith, the purgation of memory by hope, and the will by charity. John insists on the Christological nature of this purifying process, which he calls supreme nakedness and emptiness of spirit. That's the truest following of Jesus, who died fully annihilated on the cross, crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And John explicitly cites that text in Ascent, Book 2, Chapter 7. John didn't finish his account of the active night before he turned to the passive nights of sense and spirit in the 2 books of the Dark Night Treatise. The passive night of the senses, which deals with overcoming the imperfections that disturb even advanced souls, are common to many according to John, while the passive night of the spirit, treated in Book 2, is experienced only by few. It's here, the passive night of the spirit, that John makes his deeply felt and systematic contribution to the theme of mystical affliction. The passive night of the spirit involves a dark contemplation that is felt as inner suffering, even torture, a dry emptiness in which God is seen as the agent of pain, and in which the soul becomes so numb by suffering as to be incapable of action. Some modern investigators have compared John's analysis of the inner dismantling of the old self to modern depressive states. And the verbal analogies are sometimes telling, although for John, the dark night of the spirit, while sounding like disintegration of depression perhaps, is actually aimed at a new integration, the unification, reunification of the true self obtained in mystical union. Book 2 of the Dark Night has God totally in control, and he does whatever is necessary to bring the purifying process to its transformative conclusion. As John puts it, he leaves the intellect in darkness, the will in aridity, the memory in emptiness, and the affections in supreme affliction, bitterness, anguish, by depriving the soul of the feeling and satisfaction it had previously obtained from its spiritual blessings. In chapters 5 through 9 of Book 2, again and again, John returns to the language of suffering and torment in ways very reminiscent of the earlier mystics we've examined. I'll just give a few examples. John says, persons feel so unclean and wretched that it seems that God is against them and they are against God. Another passage, sometimes this experience is so vivid that it seems to the soul that it sees hell and perdition opening before it. Although the souls in this state continue to love God or have the desire to love God, they are unable to believe that God loves them. Book 2, Chapter 7. But the goal is not suffering for sake of suffering. After intellect, memory, and will have been fully cleansed by the substantial darkness felt in the soul's very substance, the now purified soul is ready to feel the sublime and marvelous touches of divine love. And of course, those touches of divine love are central to San Juanist mysticism. It would be, winding up now, it would be fruitful to pursue our theme into the great age of French mysticism of the 17th century, where there are a multitude of witnesses, such as the personal accounts of the Ursuline Marie de l'Incarnation in her 2 relations. And even more interesting, perhaps, to pursue the profound teaching of Francis de Sales on tribulation and the love of total surrender in the Treatise on the Love of God. Book 9 of the Treatise on the Love of God, particularly chapters 11, 12 through 13, compare with John of the Cross, actually, in terms of the power of their descriptions of the inner suffering of the soul after the pattern of Christ on the cross, and the 2 expressions, my God, why have you forsaken me? And finally, into your hands I commend my spirit. But we don't have time for that. Rather, I'll close with 2 modern women mystics whose lives and teaching involve profound inner suffering and the sense of being abandoned by God. The Carmelite nun Teresa of Lisieux, died 1897, now known through her true writings instead of the versions doctored to advance her canonization, is a powerful witness to an inner dereliction caused by her temptations against faith during the last years of her physical suffering physical suffering through tuberculosis. So last months of 1897. In her autobiographical story of the soul, she speaks of how she found it impossible to believe that there were people without faith until Jesus sent her into a cloud of the lack of faith. I quote, "He permitted my soul to be invaded by the thickest darkness, and that the thought of heaven, up till then so sweet to me, be no longer anything but a cause of struggle and torment. Traveling through this dark tunnel was not a passing experience, but continued almost down to her death. She says she could not adequately describe the darkness that obscured her soul, saying even that she didn't want to write about it any longer because I might blaspheme. I fear even that I have already said too much. Nevertheless, Therese asks Jesus, is there a joy greater than that of suffering out of love for you? My final example is that of Mother Teresa of Calcutta, a mystic of our own times. It was not until the publication of the posthumous private writings of the Saint of Calcutta that awareness of her long years of mystical dereliction became public knowledge. The nature of this prolonged dark night, even the status of the documents, have provoked much discussion, and I can't go into that here. But the laments and expressions of pain found in many of the letters she sent to her clerical advisors and confessors should by now be quite familiar. And of course, I know many of you have read this text. I'll just cite one example from a letter she wrote September 3, 1959. They say people in hell suffer eternal pain because of the loss of God. They would go through all that suffering if they just had a little hope of possessing God. In my soul, I feel just that pain of terrible loss, of God not wanting me, of God not being God, of God not really existing. In my heart, there is no faith, no love, no trust. There is so much pain, the pain of not being wanted. So to conclude, the prophet Malachi says that God is a refining fire. And the Old Testament prophets were aware of the purgative aspect of God and spoke of the fear and distress that encountering the God of fire could induce in those who came close to him. The theme of mystical affliction and dereliction in the history of Christian mysticism builds on this, but it took a new direction that was centered on Christ's passion and death. For the Christian mystics, it was not just because God is so radically other from humans as the mysterium tremendum, that meaning God involves suffering and affliction, sometimes even a sense of God's withdrawal, leaving his lovers abandoned and derelict in what seems like hell. The Christian mystics who suffered the pain of the loss of God took solace in the sense that they were being invited to fulfill the sufferings that Jesus himself had experienced, especially on the cross when he cried out, my God, why have you abandoned me?" Affliction and dereliction, therefore, are not peripheral to Christian mysticism. They're at its heart. So thank you. Thanks.